Now, in this second video on the Gospel of Matthew, we want to look at points 3 and 4, as Matthew presents Jesus as the rejected king and then the returning king. So number 3, Matthew presents Jesus as the rejected king. Now, rejected by who? Well, mostly in the Gospel of Matthew, he presents Jesus as being rejected by the Jews. And many of the stories that Matthew tells of Jewish rejection are meant to paint the Jews in a very negative light. In other words, he wants to show that it's unwise for the Jews to reject Jesus. It's kind of silly for them to reject Jesus. And so, obviously, the point of those stories is to a Jewish audience to tell them, don't be unwise, don't be silly, don't reject Jesus, but accept him as the true Jewish king. So let's start with number 3, Jesus the rejected king. In Matthew 13, Matthew tells a story where Jesus is almost stoned in his own hometown. And that's Nazareth, of course. And Jesus goes to Nazareth, to the synagogue there, and his own hometown people, Jewish people, reject him and, in fact, want to kill him and stone him. The point of that story, of course, is that Matthew wants to say, don't be silly like that. Don't be unwise like those Jews in Nazareth, but rather accept Jesus and listen to what he says. Point number 2 there is Herod the Great tries to kill Jesus in Matthew chapter 2. Herod the Great, the king of the Jews, obviously rejects Jesus as the king of the Jews, but so do all the Jewish scribes and scholars around Herod the Great. They read the Old Testament and they reject Jesus too. And Matthew tells that story, again, which is only in Matthew, to show that it's very unwise for the Jews to reject Jesus as their Jewish king. The next story there is in Matthew 10, where Jesus warns the disciples of persecution. Jesus sends the disciples out 2 by 2. He sends them among the Jewish people, and he warns them that they're going to be rejected, that the disciples are going to be persecuted, that the Jewish people are not going to accept the message of Jesus. And so again, a very unique story, only in Matthew, which paints the Jews in a negative light, rejecting Jesus. Of course, the point of the story is that a Jewish audience will read this, and rather than reject Jesus, they'll accept him. The next point there is that Jesus predicts the destruction of Jerusalem and Jewish rejection. You can read that story in Matthew 21, where Jesus says, Jews, if you reject me, the kingdom is going to be taken away from you. Obviously, the Jews thought that they were going to be part of God's kingdom, but by rejecting Jesus, the kingdom, in fact, is taken away, and it's given to others. The next point there is from the crucifixion scene in Matthew 27, where Jesus is on the cross, and he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, of course, here it's Jesus sort of being rejected by God, but again, Jesus is painted as a rejected king. And then the next point is in Matthew 2, where the story of the birth of Jesus, and it turns out that in that story, it's the Gentiles who go to Bethlehem, these shepherds, these wise men who go to Bethlehem, and not the Jewish scholars who know the Old Testament so well and should have known that the Messiah, Jesus, was going to be born in Bethlehem, but rather than go and accept him and worship him, it's the wise men. And remember, the wise men story is only in Matthew, so Matthew emphasizes Gentiles accepting Jesus and Jewish people foolishly rejecting him. The next point there is that in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is openly proclaimed as the Messiah, and he's rejected. Here's the story in Matthew from chapter 3, which is the baptism of Jesus, and that voice from heaven said, "This is my Son, whom I love, with whom I am well pleased." So the voice from heaven in a very public way, so that everyone around the baptism of Jesus can hear it. This is my Son. You ought to accept him, in other words. The same story in Mark. Notice, the voice says a little bit different. You are my Son, whom I love. And so Mark records a more private conversation between God and Jesus that the public doesn't hear. But in Matthew, it's a public proclamation that Jesus is the Son of God, the Jewish king. And so obviously the Jews who hear that are held accountable and responsible for responding. But of course, when they don't, it shows their Jewish rejection. A unique parable to Matthew. Matthew has several unique parables that are only in Matthew, not in the other Gospels, and one of them is the parable of the two sons in Matthew chapter 21. You can read that. It's a delightful story. Here it is, where this father tells his two sons in the morning, go work in the vineyard. And then verse 30, the father says to the other son the same thing, go work in the vineyard. But the first son changed it when he said, I will go. But then in the end, he didn't go. The second son, who said he wouldn't go, in the end, he does go. And Jesus says, to sum up that parable, truly I tell you, the tax collectors and prostitutes are entering the kingdom of God. For John, that's John the Baptist, came to show you the way of righteousness, and you did not believe him, but the tax collectors and prostitutes did. Obviously, the first son is meant to represent the Jewish people who had every advantage and who said yes to God, but when it came time to believe in Jesus, they didn't show up in the vineyard and they didn't believe. The Gentile people who had no idea of Jesus, and in the end, though, they're the ones who show up in the vineyard to work. They're the ones who believe in Jesus. So again, a unique story of Jewish rejection and Gentile acceptance. And the story, of course, is meant to show how foolish it is to reject Jesus. Another unique parable to Matthew is in chapter 20, verses 1 to 16, the parable of the workers who are paid equally. Here is a story of workers who work in the vineyard. Some work for 1 hour, some work for 5 hours, some work for 12 hours, but they all get paid equally. And those who work for 12 hours complain that they should get paid more. And of course, that's meant to represent the Jewish people. They think they should be paid more, but the parable is meant to show that God has grace on the Gentiles, and yet the Jewish people have rejected him. And then finally, the last example here of Jesus as a rejected king is where at the trial of Jesus, just before his crucifixion, Pontius Pilate insists that Jesus is innocent and several times wants to release him. But it's the Jewish people who keep calling and calling for Jesus' death. Again, a very unique story to Matthew, where he paints the Jews in a very negative light as people who reject Jesus. But remember, these stories are told to encourage Jews who read this gospel. Don't be unwise like these Jews in the gospel who reject Jesus, but rather be wise and accept Jesus as the Jewish Messiah. And then finally, point number 4, Matthew presents Jesus as the returning king, a king who will come back to this earth a second time with authority and power. And you can see some of the examples here. Matthew chapters 24 and 25 are often referred to as the little apocalypse. Apocalypse is a word that refers to the end times, the second coming of Jesus. And so these are stories, parables that are told only in the Gospel of Matthew that talk about Jesus' second coming. He's going to return, and he's going to be the authoritative, powerful king. You can read the parable of the weeds in Matthew 13. That's also a parable about the return of Jesus and his power. The parable of the bridesmaids and the talents is, again, only in Matthew, a second coming parable where Jesus says, you better be ready because I'm coming back in power and authority. Matthew 25, Jesus tells about the final judgment. Again, a story only in Matthew. And then finally, Matthew says that the king who returns in power and glory will sit on his throne in the end. So Matthew presents Jesus as a returning king who's going to be authoritative and powerful. And again, not just rule over the Jewish people, but now be a king that will rule over both Jews and Gentiles and the entire world. So Jesus is a true king, a royal king, number 1. He is a Jewish king, number 2. He is a rejected king by the Jews, number 3. And then finally, he is the returning king in power and authority. All right, let me just briefly comment on the outline of Matthew's gospel. And it's It's a very unique outline. It's presented in very Jewish form, as of course Matthew is the Jewish gospel to the Jews to present Jesus as the Jewish king. And this is the way he organizes his gospel. He has an introduction where it includes the birth narrative of Jesus. Jesus is born and the wise men come and visit Jesus. That's the introduction. Then at the end, he has a conclusion. Jesus is crucified and rises from the dead and then commissions his disciples. That's the conclusion. But in between that introduction and conclusion, Matthew presents his gospel in 5 sections. It's a very systematic method. It's very structured. It's almost like a catechism with 5 sections. And obviously those 5 sections are meant to sort of echo the 5 books of the Torah in the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. 5 books of the Torah for the Jews in the Old Testament. And now Matthew presents his gospel in a very Jewish way with these 5 major sections to sort of represent, this is the new Torah. The Torah in the Old Testament was God's way to live. And now as Matthew presents the story of Jesus in these 5 sections, kind of just like a Torah, he's saying, no, now this is the way to live, as Jesus tells you. Furthermore, each of those 5 sections has 2 parts. There's a narrative and a discourse. The narrative section has stories about Jesus, and then the discourse is Jesus teaching. And then after those 2 parts, narrative and discourse, in each of those 5 sections, there's a transitional phrase. After Jesus had finished saying these things, and then it goes on to the next part. So this is a very systematic outline to Matthew in very Jewish style to present his gospel, the story of Jesus, as kind of the new Torah. So for example, here you can see that first section begins in chapters 3 and 4 with a narrative. Those are stories about Jesus' early Galilean ministry. Galilee was in the north around the Sea of Galilee, and there are stories about Jesus there. Then the discourse in part 1 is the Sermon on the Mount, which is unique to Matthew. And that's Jesus teaching, again, about life in the kingdom. Well, think about that Galilean ministry in chapters 3 and 4, where Jesus begins. Let me just show you a few pictures about and some maps about where Jesus began his ministry. Here you can see the Sea of Galilee, and there are 3 major cities: Capernaum, Chorazin, and Bethsaida. These 3 cities right here, Chorazin, Capernaum, and Bethsaida, they kind of form a triangle, and Jesus spent most all of his time, his 3-year public ministry, in those 3 cities. And of those 3 cities, Capernaum, right on the Sea of Galilee, was the headquarters. It was kind of the home base for Jesus' 3-year public ministry. It's kind of where he lived and taught most of the time. Here you see a photograph today of the northwest side of the Sea of Galilee, and Capernaum would have been located right here, right along the sea. And then those other 2 cities were, here's Bethsaida over here, and then Chorazin, not really indicated on the map, is up in this area. Here you see a photograph of that same area. And this little mountain, can't really see it's a mountain, but that's called the Mount of Beatitudes, or the place where Jesus delivered his Sermon on the Mount, as people listen to that in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. Here again is a photograph now sort of sitting on the Mount of Beatitudes and looking out over the Sea of Galilee. It's where Jesus delivered his Sermon on the Mount. And now you're looking at Capernaum and some of the remains in that city of Capernaum. This right here that sort of looks like a spaceship is actually a Catholic church that's been built over the location of Peter's house. Peter was from Capernaum, and his family lived there, and it's probably that Jesus, when he was in Capernaum, lived at Peter's house. So archaeologists found the remains of Peter's house, and you can actually go underneath this and sort of look at it, but they built a church to commemorate Peter's house. And this over here is the remains of the synagogue in Capernaum. Of course, Jesus taught in synagogues all over Galilee, and this was a very large synagogue, and it was the home base of Jesus in Capernaum. So many times Jesus taught in that synagogue in Capernaum. There you see the picture of the synagogue. And there's the remains of the synagogue that stands in Capernaum today. And it's an interesting place to visit because we know that Jesus taught in this synagogue and stood in this place when he was here on earth. There's an artist's drawing of maybe what the synagogue in Capernaum would have looked like in Jesus' day. And certainly Jesus visited this place again and taught there many times. Here's a passage of scripture. It's from the Gospel of John, not Matthew, but here it says that Jesus made this teaching while he was in the synagogue in Capernaum. This is Jesus' famous bread of life teaching that's recorded in the Gospel of John, but it says that he did that while he was in the synagogue in Capernaum. Again, the home base for Jesus' public ministry. There you see a picture of the synagogue that still stands in Capernaum, at least some of the remains of it. And there it is again. There you see it again. There it is again. Very unique architecture to a synagogue that I don't have time to explain right now, but Jesus was here and he taught in that place many times. There you see it again. So that's the first part of Matthew's 5-part structure here, sort of echoing the Old Testament Torah. Part number 2, you see here, again, there's a narrative and a discourse. Miracle stories in 8 and 9. Those are, Matthew kind of lumps all the miracles into those 2 chapters that happened over Jesus' lifetime to, again, present the royal credentials for Jesus as king. And then the teaching in the discourse section of that second part in Matthew 9 and 10, where Jesus instructs his disciples to go out and announce his kingdom. And then part 3, again, a narrative and a discourse, stories and teaching, stories about Jesus' claim to messiahship. He's the Lord of the Sabbath. And then the teaching section of that third part are 7 kingdom parables. Matthew records 7 parables that Jesus tells. 5 of them, 5 of the 7, are found only in Matthew. So that's the teaching section of part number 3. And then section number 4, again, narrative and discourse. You have stories about Jesus' mission in crisis. There you see Jesus, the stories include Jesus being rejected at Nazareth. There's the death of John the Baptist. Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" So there's a bit of a crisis. And then the teaching of Jesus on the need for humility, that grace and humility characterize the kingdom. You must come into the kingdom as a little child, chapter 18. And then this is the story where Jesus tells Peter, you don't just forgive 7 times, but you forgive 70 times 7. Then the 5th section, again, stories and teaching, narrative and discourse, stories about Jesus on the way to the cross. And then the teaching is Jesus teaching on the last things. That's that little apocalypse, those stories that are unique to Matthew about Jesus' second return. Well, let's wrap up this teaching on the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew's special emphasis that is found only in his Gospel is that he emphasizes the authority of Jesus. He is a king. He has power. He has authority. And there are several verses that point out Jesus' authority. Here's just one of them in Matthew 7. When Jesus finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had, and there's the word, authority, and not as the other teachers of the Torah. Jesus had authority. Now, the Hebrew word that refers to This kind of authority is the word simcha. Matthew wants to present Jesus as a rabbi, as a teacher who teaches with simcha. Now, in the Jewish culture, there were two kinds of rabbis. There were Torah teachers, and there were rabbis with simcha. Torah teachers were teachers who could teach the Torah, but they had to sort of repeat what their teachers had told them. They couldn't make new interpretations and give new teachings. Rabbis with simcha, though, could offer new interpretations, brand new interpretations. And Matthew says that that's what Jesus does in this gospel. He's a rabbi and a teacher who doesn't have to just repeat what he heard before, but he can give brand new interpretations, the true and full interpretations of the Old Testament Torah. Rabbis who taught with simcha would teach with this sort of formula. You know, they would say, it was written in the Old Testament. You have heard that this means this in the Old Testament, but I tell you that it means this. You'll obviously recognize that as the formula that Jesus uses in the Sermon on the Mount. You have heard that it was said, Jesus says, but I say to you, and then he gives the fuller, more complete teaching on the Torah. He's a rabbi with the highest level of authority who teaches with simcha. Here you see some of the well-known Jewish rabbis of Jesus' day, Hillel and Shammai and Gamaliel, who also taught with simcha. And you see how old they are, 70, 85, and 70. Of course, Jesus is a rabbi, a teacher who teaches with simcha, but of course Jesus was only 30 years old. That's why Matthew says that the crowds were amazed that Jesus taught with authority, that he taught with simcha. Here's Rabbi Akiba, another well-known Jewish rabbi at the time of Jesus who taught with simcha at the age of 60. Here you see Matthew's references to Jesus teaching with authority. He teaches with authority. He has the authority to forgive sins. He has the authority to cast out demons. He has the authority to cleanse the temple. And of course, only Matthew uses that word authority or simcha to refer to the actions of Jesus. He is a king with authority. And then, very famously, Matthew ends his gospel. Only in Matthew, not in any of the other gospels, Matthew ends his gospel in the Great Commission, where Jesus says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. So indeed, Jesus is a true king with authority and power. Let me complete our discussion of Matthew by just making these three final points. Number one, Matthew preserves a large part of Jesus' teaching. There are large blocks of teaching in Matthew that are only found in Matthew. It's very popular reading in the early church, and the church would be greatly impoverished without these great blocks of teaching that Matthew records. Very unique. For example, as I mentioned already, the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, only in Matthew. Some of those five unique parables in Matthew 13, only in Matthew. And then that little apocalypse, Matthew's teaching on Jesus' second coming, again, only in Matthew. So we need the Gospel of Matthew in this teaching of Jesus. Secondly, Matthew complements the other Gospels, but especially the Gospel of Luke. For example, the birth narrative is told, the birth of Jesus, only in Matthew and only in Luke. And they tell it from different perspectives. Matthew describes the story of Jesus' birth from the perspective and through the eyes of Joseph, Jesus' father. Luke tells the story of Jesus' birth through the eyes of Jesus' mother, Mary. Matthew talks about the wise men. Luke talks about the shepherds. So if we put those two Gospels together, we get a complete picture of Jesus. So Matthew gives a unique perspective on Jesus, particularly his birth. And finally, Matthew's use of the Old Testament is rich and complex. As I said, Matthew has more quotes from the Old Testament than any other gospel. meant to show that Jesus is the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy, which means that we can sort of read the Old Testament Christologically. That is, as we read the Old Testament, we can read it with an eye on Jesus as the one who will fulfill that whole story. In fact, when you read the Gospel of Matthew, what you're reading sometimes in the stories of Jesus is sort of a reenactment of the Old Testament stories. I gave you an example earlier of how Matthew describes Jesus as sort of a reenactment of Moses. And so the Gospel of Matthew is a valuable gospel, begins the canon. It's the first one, and it follows very nicely after the Old Testament. Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew is presented as the king.